Hello and welcome to the dark side. We are delighted that you are joining us this evening for some fun education. I say fun, but it's more education, really, isn't it? Mr. Storm, welcome. How you doing?
What's up?
Stuff. Right, I'm going to dive straight in because we have a lot of news stories to cover before we get to our main story. So the first news story I want to cover is that of the UK's planned removal of asylum seekers to Rwanda. This has created a storm. The first date is actually this Tuesday. And those campaigners are taking it to court, but the court has ruled that the flight can go ahead, even though there will be court hearings later to look at the validity of whether asylum seekers to the UK should be deported to Rwanda. Or removed to Rwanda. I think they're trying to sanitize it, right? You're not being deported, you're being removed, relocated to Rwanda. There are a number of stories that surround this, but the main thing is that the courts are holding up that Priti Patel and her government can deport people to Rwanda. Did the storm do this? I hope he didn't do this. Hi. Hi, Daniel. Good to see you too. Alrighty. So, Mr. Storm, any thoughts on this story? I think it's going to be filling our headlines for the coming months. I'm sure we will have lots more to talk about it, but I want to keep it fresh in people's mind that the British government are actually going ahead with this plan. They have thus far refused to have offices within Europe to help with people trying to claim asylum to the UK, but now have managed to have pop-up ones across Europe in order to deport people from Europe to Rwanda who are claiming asylum in the UK. So there is an Iranian ex-police commander who's obviously seeking asylum in the UK. He's actually in Turkey, but he's being deported to Rwanda, and he is the reason his case is relevant is because he fears that, of course, he will be killed there by Iranian forces that operate within the Rwandan area. But the UK maintains Rwanda is a perfectly safe country and everyone should be happy to go there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, once again, I'm just going to ask, does Rwanda have refugees?
Yes, because and again, this gets to the heart of the matter. Of course, the laws surrounding LGBTQIA issues are a leftover remnant of colonialism, and therefore their LGBTQIA population are seeking refuge in other countries because they're trying to flee death.
And yet Rwanda is safe.
Yes.
Now, look, don't get me wrong. Rwanda is safer than, well, pretty much nearly every European country going.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we shouldn't ignore that. But the idea that it is without danger or peril,
yeah,
I'm not so sure about that. And how are they then determining who it is safe to send to Rwanda and who it is not safe for? Because the reality is, if you've done all that work, you pretty much already know whether they qualify for asylum or not.
Well, and I think this is one of the grounds that they are being challenged on in court, is how are you actually going through and determining this? Daniel says, send me to Rwanda, please. Yeah, at this point, if it is that safe, cool, like we'll all sign up for the trip, right? But it's a really interesting, it's going to come up over and over again. The big case will be heard in July in the high courts to determine whether this is legal. In the meantime, people will be deported to Rwanda. And so that's the main point. The main point is, instead of holding it, again, we have seen this again and again, and we'll look at this somewhat in our main story. The methodology of the British government is to deport people first, ask questions later, or be challenged and allow the challenge later. And then be found to be wrong. But by the time they do that, people have died. And we've seen that with the Windrush generation. People have been deported out to various countries throughout the Caribbean and then have subsequently died through the process of how long it took to get reparations, to recover, or to have their name cleared in some cases, etc., etc. But they've grown old and they have died within that process. And the government went, oh no, look, we made a mistake. Oh dear. So that's the story. We're going to cover more of it as the weeks go on, I'm sure. We're going to look at a little bit of this issue of asylum seekers, but also how the way that British colonialism has struck again. So we'll look at this in our main story. But for now, let's go on with our news. All right, I want to read to you the headline, and then I want to tell you the story. So the headline read, 13-year-old boy killed by San Antonio police was grieving death of sister, his mother says. Okay. So the way that the story was originally broken was that the headlines are reading, mother was not told that 13-year-old boy had been shot dead by police for 5 days. And every time I read the headline, I got further and further confused. And so what I wanted to talk to you about today is to actually look at this story in a different way. So there is a mother who is grieving the loss of her 16-year-old daughter. Her 13-year-old son is grieving the loss of his 16-year-old sister. This is a fresh story. 2 weeks earlier, they had to bury her. She had died within the month. She had been shot and found in the local area, and that case was ongoing. So she's the family are in distress. The 13-year-old boy is acting out or has gotten in with the bad crowd. We don't know what the situation is, but this child is then found in a stolen vehicle. The police find the vehicle, find the child in the vehicle, and what happens next, no one is completely sure of because, of course, body cameras are switched off. We enjoy that process in the States, and information isn't being released properly. So the 5-day period is the fact that the mother has to go to the hospital to look for her son. She's been notified that he's there. She's been notified he's been shot. He subsequently dies. All of this, she doesn't know how her child is dead. She doesn't know what's happened to him, but this is where she is at. 5 days it takes her to figure out what's happened. And the way she figures it out is by reading the newspapers and finding out that the San Antonio police have shot dead a 13-year-old boy. I can't imagine being a mother and reading the newspaper and finding out that it was actually the police that shot my son. They shot him after finding him in a stolen vehicle, joyriding. The car had come to a standstill by all accounts. There are some accounts which say he got out and was surrendering. There are other accounts that say he was dragged and he was begging them not to hurt him further after they had shot him. Either which way you look at it, whatever happened is shady. It's not good, and they shot a child. That's the reality. And you can say 13-year-old young adult till you're blue in the face. I know 13-year-olds. You shot a 13-year-old child, right? And you didn't inform the mother that you were actually investigating a police officer shooting of their 13-year-old. So this story strikes a nerve in that way. I think it strikes a nerve because the question is, the police are always going to be dealing with people who have criminal actions, right? That's their domain. That's what police should be set up for. Does that mean they have the right to shoot and execute people because they fear for their life? No. You don't have a right to expedite your own justice upon people because you've decided that they're bad and they're not worth actually taking the time to negotiate and get them safely out and then press charges and go through the criminal justice system. And I think this story speaks to a really deep-seated issue that you could have a mother in a hospital grieving her daughter and then confused, bewildered as to why her son is dead and not say a word to her in the whole time. She's asking questions, trying to figure out the pieces, and she has to read a newspaper to figure out it's an internal investigation that you are having to undergo because you shot her son. It's not a nice story out of the San Antonio police. Anything you would like to add on that, Mr. Storm?
Not really, except that what this incident has once again highlighted is the cesspool of humanity that you find in the comment section.
Oh, marvelous. It was
I
awful.
think
It was not pretty.
it's not. And I see people, as you said, they say, oh, he's a young adult. And what you're dealing with is, once again, the adultification of black and brown bodies,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? Because had this been a 13-year-old blonde haired, blue eyed girl who had been raped by a pedophile, we wouldn't be talking about a 13-year-old adult. We'd be talking about a 13-year-old child. They are
Well,
both.
probably the wrong analogy because they do adultify girls as well. But I think the point is well made that if it was a 13-year-old girl who was shot, she'd be a child and she would remain a child. And that's the reality, and that I think is a point well made. If a 13-year-old is a child, they are a child. There is no argument to be made about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, it is. I don't think there's much that needs to be said about it. It was wrong. This was a child. And they killed a child. The one thing I will say is that no matter what the discrepancies in the report are, or what witnesses are saying, there's one constant idea that runs through it, and that is that this child did not present a threat to the
Yes.
police officers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is no justification.
No, they were, and that I think is really heartbreaking because, of course, teachers are expected to keep their calm in the face of a 13-year-old child and not do anything when their children can blow up and throw chairs and blah, 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 so on and so forth. And everyone expects that a teacher, one singular adult, can maintain a classroom full of 13-year-olds, right? A police officer, several cars of police officers can't maintain their cool when faced with one singular 13-year-old. What does that tell you about police? And I think that's a fundamental problem. So if I, as a singular teacher, have to be able to maintain my cool, work out how to negotiate a situation, calm down, diffuse very volatile situations with 13-year-olds, as a previous teacher, I've had to do that, then what does it say that a group of adults cannot do that for one? Well, in fact, there were 3 young children that were involved in it, but one is dead. That to me is the most ridiculous and immoral thing that we can come up with.
Yeah, but you must remember that as a teacher, you have more training than police officers in the US.
Indeed. But even, indeed. Yes, indeed. Being a black boy is a threat to the police. Carl Rittenhouse is still being considered a child. Police are incompetent. Yeah, I mean, that's really the truth of it, right? That unfortunately is the truth. So I have 2 stories next that I want to get to. The 2 stories are about the way that rape laws work. The hymn by Oh, I have to laugh. You guys make me laugh. The hymn by NWA. Is that what it is now? It's a hymn. Okay, praise the Lord. Amen. Hallelujah. Okay, there are 2 rape stories I want to get to today. One is one out of Australia and the other one is out of France and Belgium. The one out of France and Belgium is about the fact that there was, over the course of 30 years, approximately 1 every couple of months rape, assault, sexual assault, etc. In this region of France, Belgium. And the gentleman Tabitha, the man who has committed these attacks is actually going on trial for these crimes now. He's now 61 years old. He's going on crimes for 17 rapes, 12 attempts, 27 sexual assaults. The victims' ages ranged from 13 to 48. And there are many who refuse to come forward because of the scars, the war wounds, but he is now going on court. This happened in a region of France and Belgium. And the importance of reporting is so key, because of course within this region you're talking about it being on a border of two different countries with two different police networks and two different justice systems. And so the close working that has had to come together in order to do that, something that the European countries do actually do quite well, but of course that has required women to come forward and report. And the reality is that many women, particularly in this case is what we're talking about, the majority don't report because of the way that they're treated. But there are 56 charges against this man over a 30-year period, and he will now be tried in court. So this is a good thing. They had to do a lot of work to catch him, though. They had to put up extra cameras. They had to do photo fits. I mean, it was ridiculous. The level of work that had to go in to catch this one rapist is unbelievable. And of course, the women's testimonies is never enough. So you need to have additional materials. And that's always a problem. Oh, sorry, I was putting up the same quote as you. After they report there is a trial, that questions their credibility. Yeah, every single time we've talked about this issue. And to that brings us to the Australian case. Now, the Australian case centers on a woman called Saxon Mullins. She is trying to change the laws there to make it so that you have to be, let me get the word in. It is, let me get the word in properly. Where is the wording? Oh, what is it? What is it? What is it? Where does it say it? Oh, it's really bad when you have to find the exact wording for something and you can't. Affirmative consent. That's what I wanted to look for. Thank you. So what this is in New South Wales, in Australia, she suffered a rape when she was 18 years old. She was at an event. She went out into the alley with somebody. She didn't want to stay there. She tried to get back into the building. He then became aggressive and she froze. And in freezing, he proceeded to do what he did, which is to rape her. After the court case, he was found guilty, and then in the appeal, it was overturned because the judge felt like she should have just said no. Because she froze, that wasn't enough. And she then said, when you're faced with violence, fight, flight, freeze is a natural response. You shouldn't be penalized for freezing. And so she has been campaigning to change the law so that it is affirmative consent. If you are going to engage, male or female, in a sexual activity, there should be affirmative consent, which means that instead of looking for the absence of the absence of a no, you're looking for a positive confirmation of a yes. There has been a lot of discussion as to whether this then makes it too difficult for people to have these lovely entanglements. It takes the fun and the edge out of it. What made me think about this case is that I've recently seen a sketch a piece by Trevor Noah, and he talks about the fact that in old school porn, he learned about consent to a certain degree, because everything was, do you want it? Do you want it? Do you want this? Do you want that? Do you want this? And it was consent was made to feel sexy. It was made to feel part of the narrative of how you actually engage with sex with another person. So the idea that consenting to a sexual activity detracts from the fun or the free spiritness of it seems a mythical idea, and actually continues to fuel rape culture. But she's managing to fight through, and it looks like this is going to come into law, and the reforms are at least the first step towards changing Australian law for good. And maybe this will have a knock-on effect around the world, who knows? But at least it will be interesting to see the effect that it has on that community there in New South Wales. Mr. Storm, any thoughts?
I think the judge that overturned the conviction, possibly an incel,
possibly,
or I feel sorry for his partner.
Yeah.
or spouse or whatever. Because here's the reality of the thing. If somebody is not participating, you know it's a no.
Well, I
I'm
think
like,
that, yeah, it's, yeah, yeah,
so if this woman has frozen and is not engaging or participating,
yeah.
I think we can say, it's safe to assume she doesn't want to be there.
Yeah, and if only
Because
she's participating with the threat of violence, because is what then began to happen, is she was frozen, so then
right.
punch, pinch, blah,
So
blah,
so
blah.
my point is once it begins, you definitely know she doesn't want to be there,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Um, so I'm just like, yeah, this judge, I all I can say, or all I can do is speak from my experience of having sex. There has been action voluntarily from both parties. And
Affirmative.
if there wasn't, I have questions about what's happening.
Again, affirmative consent. That's what they're now
Yeah,
looking for.
I'm firmly in favor of affirmative consent. And listen, if somebody says, it takes spontaneity or whatever out of what happens, you know what? I'm all fine with that if there means that there are less victims that are traumatized
Yeah,
by these situations,
absolutely.
and both parties can be clear. Listen, me personally, I'd be like, listen, if somebody said to me I had to sign a form, I'm happy to sign a form before sectioner.
But this is the irony. So as I find it quite ironic because I feel like that it's not true that most men would be like, oh, you want me to sign a waiver before I have sex? Like, give me the waiver. Where is it? Just like, we're gonna have sex? Well, hey, let's go. So what happened to that attitude? Where did that go? Daniel says that common sense cannot be assumed. No, it can't. And I think that that's why this law is so important. Affirmative consent means that you have to either verbally say something or physically do something that gives the person the go ahead. And then comes this other layer, which is consent for sex doesn't mean consent to every single act. And that's another part of the conversation. So, of course, I may consent to have sex with you, but then you might want to do an action that I don't want to do. And once I've said no to that, that should be enough. And I kind of feel like men would enjoy sex regardless. So that's just my idea. Anyway.
Listen, I'm like, if you gave me a 2 or 3 page contract that I had to read through about what was or wasn't acceptable during sex before we had sex, I don't care. I'm having sex.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, yeah. Yeah. Well, it depends on the waiver. As I said, it depends what you're saying. But the basic premise is, of course, should you have affirmative consent? And I think that that clearly needs to be taught from a very young age to children, that if you're not consenting to something, then it shouldn't happen. So I should be able to say yes or no. Daniel says he's reading every line, but you'd still be excited to have sex.
Damn Skippy.
You might be reading every line, but you'd be like,
Listen,
I'm reading because I want to. That's the point, isn't it? I want to
listen, I get undressed as I read in the thing. Yeah. My signature at the end is just a formality to all of this, right? You tell me you don't want this? That's cool.
Oh, it's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, it seems so common sense. At least we can laugh about it. I think for this poor woman, of course, she's been completely traumatized by the justice system and is doing very brilliant work to try and overturn, to actually change the law and to work in the favor of other victims. And I really do hope that this makes a bigger splash within the legal frameworks and actually becomes the norm around the world, that you actually have to confirm in some way, shape, or form, I have to consent to what's happening. And from there, we can probably move on to better and more, better laws and better protections for people in these situations. I think that's
Absolutely.
probably enough to say today. All right, so our main story today, I did have another news story, but I'm not going to get to it. Let's do our main story today. So our main story is that the Home Office, some of you will remember we did an episode on the Windrush scandal. So for those of you that don't remember this, so some years ago now it feels like, we looked at the Windrush scandal. And what is the Windrush? Is the generation of people who came from the Caribbean to Britain to rebuild it after the war. These were workers from all backgrounds with different skills, different educational levels, that came to actually build up the empire, to build up the home country, to build up the Queen's Land. They were sold this in many advertisings and many ways. They were invited to the UK, and upon arrival, they were greeted with hostility, with signs that said no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, or whichever way round those wordings went, but left them feeling very excluded. They had to live in difficult situations. They weren't necessarily paid what they should have been. They weren't respected. Many of us know people from this generation who have worked tirelessly to build up their life, their family, to actually build a life for themselves and make it in a place that was hostile towards them. It then turned out that the government who invited them was even more hostile, because after a set number of years, of course, they were granted citizenship, which seems normal. But what the Home Office did was then change the rules. Forgive me, Mr. Storm, if I say this incorrectly, but they changed the rules that they would have to prove then that they were, when they arrived in the UK, and they did that after they burnt all the papers. So they threw out all the records and then said, now you prove that you were supposed to be there. I hope I'm saying that in the correct, that you have a legal right to stay there. This then...
No, it's actually more insidious than that. They changed the law, then threw out the papers.
Oh, the other way around. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
That's
they
the other way around.
knew, they put the legal burden on those that had come and then burnt the evidence.
There you go. So there you go. That's the way around it went. I wasn't sure if it happened, which way around it happened. So it's even worse. And then what proceeds to happen over the last 10 to 15 years is that they have been systematically targeting generations of people who've spent most of their life living in the UK, paying their taxes, paying into the system, paying their NHS, working hard in the system, and they have been deporting them systematically, arresting, deporting, causing all kinds of problems to people's lives. Families have been ripped apart, and this all came out to a head and was a huge scandal for the UK. But in true colonial fashion, they had an investigation, and one of the recommendations that they had to follow was that the staff of the Home Office and the entire employee and organization of the government needed to be educated about the history of colonialism and how all of this all plays a factor, so that something like this doesn't happen again, and that people on the front lines would be more compassionate when dealing with someone who's lived in the UK their whole life, who was invited or whose parents were invited, and who had no choice but to come here, and now you're trying to upend their life. And so they employ staff at Coventry University were contracted to provide the teaching for the module last year. The university is understood to be paid about 600,000 to create a course for the Home Office on empire, migration, race, and Britain's place in the world. The Home Office made a commitment to teaching its staff about Britain's colonial and imperial history after the independent review concluded that the Windrush scandal was caused in part by the department's institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness on the issues of race and history. All sounds great. So they've employed the place, they've got the course. Deep breath. What happens next? After they receive the course, they don't like the course. They then try to employ someone else to redo the parts of the course that make them feel browbeaten or uncomfortable, because this is too difficult for their staff to deal with. And therefore, although they have devised a mandatory course for the 36,000 employees. A year later, even though it's been delivered to the Home Office, it still hasn't been delivered to its employees because the Home Office is reluctant at best and is actively seeking to sanitize the course and actually get rid of it. And so a professor who's seen both the first course and now the sanitized version says, it seems that there seemed to be a reluctance to fully engage with how bad Britain has been in terms of its role in upholding empire and its subsequent hangover. It felt as though the material had been sanitized by civil servants and parliamentarians who did not want to engage with the crux of racism. I felt like we were being asked to engage in historical amnesia. There are those that refuse to participate in it on the first place. Gus John, the human rights campaigner and academic at Coventry University, actually declined to even be a part of it in the first place. One would say it was providence. He understood what was about to happen. He says that the imperative is to actually ensure that the policies of the Home Office change. The education is neither here nor there until you actually get policy change. Now, so this is an interesting tension and an interesting discussion. What strikes me about this story is the fact that I, as an educator, feel very strongly that education, of course, is powerful. It's life transforming. Racism is and anti-racism work is at the foundation of most things that we do here on the dark side, of course. But here you have the government offices refusing to teach their own history, wanting to teach a historically amnesious history so that they don't have to deal with the issue of what they actually did, because it made the staff we don't want the staff to feel browbeaten. We don't want them to feel uncomfortable. And I just had to look at that and think, what do you mean you don't want them to feel browbeating or uncomfortable? How is telling the truth about what your country has actually engaged in browbeating a member of staff? How is that? That to me doesn't seem like browbeating. How is it that actually educating them about the country that they live in is going to make them feel so uncomfortable that they can't sit through the training? And wouldn't that make them a better officer to know the history of what's happening? To know that their country engaged in dubious activities like inviting people over and then cussing them out when they got here. Like, that's the systematic, I mean, I say it in quite a colloquial way, but that's the system that you actually employed, was that you invited people on the one hand through one marketing arm, and then there was another marketing campaign happening in the UK simultaneously, telling the people that whoever was coming to steal their jobs and were bad people, and that what kind of wicked colonial imperialist ideas are these, and how do you not fulfill your actual requirement to teach people that that's what you did? On the one hand, we're calling you, and on the other hand, once you get here, we're going to attack you. And you wonder why people don't trust the British government. You wonder why there are so many reports that say there are institutional problems. If you're going to actually undo the work of an academic institution, what was cussing was the least of their problems. Yes, I said it very colloquial. Cussing was the least of their problems. They were denied apartments to rent. You know, there were places where I know of stories, personal stories, where people literally were 10 to 12 people in one room because they couldn't find anywhere to rent. They were being attacked on the street going to work, etc. The Windrush generation lived through some awful times, and we are very grateful, those of us who are their children, to the work and to the efforts they have put in to building a better life for us, of course. But it's Mr. Storm, maybe I should bring you in here.
Right. Right. I think what this is, or it should be a lesson to those that say things like, oh, slavery was so long ago, get over it. The injustices that we're speaking of are recent.
Yes.
It was in my mother's lifetime that Black people were given the status of being human.
Yes.
And I believe in Australia, they might still be fighting for that. It may have changed, but up until recently, they were considered flora and fauna,
Yes.
the native peoples
No,
there,
yeah.
right? So I think that's the first thing. It should tell people, hold up, hold your mouth, because it wasn't that long ago.
No.
It is in living memory, these
Yes.
incidents that we are talking of. I think also this idea of being browbeaten into what your nation's history is simply an excuse, because the reality is you're perfectly happy to browbeat minority children over the head with Sir Francis Drake,
Uh-huh.
but
Mhm.
he was a slave trader,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So when we're talking about browbeating, children don't have a choice as to whether they go to school or not, or participate in these lessons or not.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you don't like the education, what is it they always say? Go get another job. As adults, you are free to go and get another job.
Well, there you go.
Child is not free to choose whether to participate in the education system or not. So if
Mhm.
anyone is browbeaten, it's going to be minority children
Mhm.
who are given a sanitized and whitewashed version of history
Mhm.
that often denigrates them, downplays the role that their peoples played in
Mhm.
history,
Mhm.
and exalts um, the British,
Yeah.
right? And I say British here because we're talking about Britain, but this is applicable to pretty much any country that you want to mention. You
Well,
know?
it's applicable to all colonial countries, right? Because
Yes.
these are the ideas that come through. And I think about the difference, like we have, living in mainland Europe, you really get to see a difference in how people treat their colonies, their former colonies, and what that relationship looks like. We've talked about this here on the dark side before. When you look at the French, the way that they treat their former colonies as basically a cash cow, and they put them into debt, and they make sure that all their money is funneled through France, and they don't have any money of their own, and they aren't allowed to access, as a nation you're not allowed to even access your own resources, and France can at any point decide that you have too much and they're going to just take some. You got those attitudes. You also have the attitudes of the Germans, let's say, towards teaching a very honest and direct kind of, this is what we did during the World War II, and yet still find it really difficult to really look at and develop the same curriculum robustness when it comes to what they did in African nations. And so we've talked about that here on the dark side. We've also talked about the Netherlands, in which you have this idea of being essentially a second-class Dutch person. You have the rights to be and come to the Netherlands and go, and you don't have to have, kind of the visa support system. And yet still, when you get here, your Dutch is never good enough. You are never good enough. And you are essentially a second-class citizen. And there is this real disconnect between those things. And yet Dutch companies can put their head offices in the former Dutch colonies to use them as places in order to circumvent Dutch tax laws. But you, as an Antillean, do not get, you're from the Dutch Caribbean, do not get those same rights to be able to do any of that. So basically, pick up this idea and mentality and apply it to any colonial country you like. It is the same principle across all of those colonial imperialistic nations. The Netherlands isn't perfect. No, the Netherlands isn't perfect. No.
Of course it is.
That's what they tell us every day.
Look,
There are
yeah,
no
if you don't
perfect
like it,
nations on
go home.
earth. Oh,
Yeah.
can I just share that story? My goodness. Oh, Daniel, if I tell you the stories about how many times I've been told to go home, you would be your toes would curl. It's been a whirlwind. It's been a
Yeah.
whirlwind.
Um, but On the subject of the story, I think also we need to bring up just how disingenuous the British government is being. And look, this particular government has a problem with race and racism. The amount of policies that they have implemented that have been found to be racist
Yeah,
needs to be mentioned.
yeah,
However, I want to say that it isn't solely the Tory party that is responsible for this. Because one of the things that comes out is that the under this education thing, they had commissioned another piece of work for education,
mm,
and that work, what that report found, or the educational um, materials that came out of it, what they found was that every, now hear me clearly, every piece of legislation that was passed in regards to immigration between 1950 and 1981 was done intentionally to limit the number of black and brown people entering the UK. We're talking about a period of 31 years. So that spans both conservative governments and Labour governments.
it does. I think it's disingenuous in some cases to blame this solely on the Tories. They definitely do amp it up without a shadow of a doubt. They make no bones about what they're doing, but the Labour government is equally as racist when it comes to black and brown bodies. That's the reality. We wouldn't be here today in this condition if it wasn't for those governments too. That's the reality. You can't slice it and dice it any other way. You've had both governments, they've both passed legislation. Would we be here today in this state? No. It took both of you to tango, and unfortunately that continues to rise.
Yeah. So for me, I look at this story, and for me, it's like business as usual. I want to do the Porky Pig, laugh. That's all, folks, because let's call this a wrap. Um,
Well,
be-
one of the things that strikes me. No, go on. Before I say that, go on. Sorry, I'm
no,
interrupting.
because as I said, for me, it's simply the continuance of the actions by this particular administration,
Mm, mm.
right? They do something messed up, and then they go, "Oh, yeah, we'll have an investigation into that." The findings come out, and so in order not to implement, they do something else that's messed up, and then go, "Oh, well, we need an investigation, and so since we're going to investigate this, we need to hold off implementing until we get the results of this investigation." And it's a continuous pattern, continuous cycle where they just screw up time after time in order to avoid just doing the right thing.
Well, this we see with the Grenfell fires. This has been in the news this week. And, to further your point that you're making, is this is exactly what the victims of the Grenfell fires, the families that are fighting for justice, the people around the country who are trying to have the cladding removed of these buildings are actually saying. There was this, for those of you that don't know, the Grenfell fires happened 4 years ago now. It took down a tower block in northwest
West.
London, in West London. And the orders that were given cost the lives of over 100 people. Died in this fire. To this day, I don't think anyone is really clear about the number of people that died. There is an official figure, but there are still people who are looking for family members. So we leave it at that. And the victims, the young people that have been campaigning to actually get change in legislation, to get change, to hold the government to account, to figure out what happened, what goes wrong. There has been investigation and conclusions and investigation and conclusions. And this pattern's been going. It's back in the news stories this week because, again, the government are still slowly moving their feet and doing the wrong thing. And the families are back in the news fighting for the rights of the families that lost loved ones, but also other buildings throughout London and the rest of the UK that are covered in this hazardous material, which contractors knew was hazardous, but that's a different issue, which the government at least knew was hazardous. And how can they be held accountable to that? It's a pattern, and it affects particularly Black and brown people, because when we talk about the systemic issues of race, anti-racism work, you're looking at communities where poverty is affected, and the systemic issues mean that Black and brown people are disproportionately affected within those categories, and it's just awful to see. The interesting thing with the cladding issue, of course, is that this spans class, because it applies to many buildings, and it applies to the fancy buildings as much as it applies to the kind of poorer neighborhood buildings. But the responsibility would have to be, they would have to own what was done here in order to do the right thing for those there, and therefore it's just not being done. And so this is a constant, to back up your point, it's a constant pattern. If you want to seek more clarification, you could look up any scandal of this government in the last 12 months, and you'll see it. You'll just see the same pattern, down to Boris Johnson's very what do you call it? What was this? Partygate. There you go. That's what it's called. Partygate. Can you believe we were this close to getting rid of him as prime minister?
We were never that close. There's too many racists.
It's very disappointing. But anyway, okay, so back to this story. One of the aspects that I wanted to look at is the education aspect. So we always talk about how powerful education is and how much power it has to change. One of the things that really scares me in some way is the reluctance, and I'm going to use the words just for the purposes of what we're trying to say, the reluctance of white people, governments, majority white governments, to actually do the reading or listen to someone's training. You literally commission somebody to train you, and then when the trainer arrived, you went, no, that's real training. We didn't want that. We don't want to have the real history. And how ridiculous is it? How can you sit there and say there aren't systemic issues that are happening? I cannot understand the disconnect. They won't simply read and understand your own history. Y'all did it. We didn't do it. Y'all did it. Like, how you don't want to read it? You're so proud of the fact that you have the Commonwealth and that you go round and the Queen is celebrating her thing, but you don't want to teach anybody about what that really means and what really happened. How you going to be holding up your flag, Commonwealth? Yay, look at us. And on the other hand, when you're taught about what the Commonwealth does, she goes, no, and then have the nerve to gaslight people and tell them there's no problem. It's infuriating. I don't know if you want to speak to the education aspect, but this was a personal bugbear.
Yeah, well, look, it's like I've always said to you that education doesn't begin until you go to university, right? Before that, it's a process of indoctrination.
Yep.
It's never education. And I think I would agree that education is powerful, which is why they don't wish to change their education. What this does, however, is it also highlights the flaws within the current educational system, because you are not okay with academics determining what is and is not a valid curriculum. Instead, you have politicians determining what is and isn't a valid education dependent on how they feel.
Preach on that.
Yes.
Yes.
So, Daniel, what I mean by education doesn't begin until you go to university is that within university, you have the freedom to present your evidence and make an argument. Your lecturer doesn't have to necessarily agree with your answer as long as you have evidence to support your position. But when you're in high school, there is an answer sheet that you must conform to.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Right?
And we've all had the answer sheets. We've done a whole story with Dr. K Trail on that one with the answer sheet already. And how do you actually, so if you want to look back on a dark side, or you want to share with somebody a dark side, we did a dark side way, way back at the beginning, 2 years ago with Dr. K Trail, which looked at this aspect of education. And she talked about how difficult it is for people to come up against a system in which the answer sheet is already given. So even though you know the evidence and you know why it's different, you've got to pass and get to your next level, you have to conform to what's being told in front of you. And what does that do to the young black, brown child who's sitting there, who knows that it's incorrect? So that's a really good one. So if you in university, professors have their preference and you can buy on that preference, yes. But you are often, and I think that's a real difference. I think both Mr. Storm and I have had the same experiences in some ways of being at school and coming up against something that is factually incorrect and challenging it as a student. This is one of the few times I was sent to the head teacher's office was over this. I was having an argument with the teacher because it was factually incorrect. And he was like, you just have to fill in the sheet. And I was like, but it's wrong. So I got sent to the head teacher's office. Whereas being at university and having a lecturer disagree with me passionately, but because I'd presented my arguments and had my evidence, I can pass you through the course. I don't like it. I don't like what's happening, but you've presented the paper in a way that structurally meets what's happening. You've met the criteria. That's a really different reality. But you have to be an adult to get to the point where you can actually have truth in some ways be taught, which is really scary.
Yeah. I said, I know I've had lecturers at that great Adventist institution who explicitly told me not to write certain papers. You gave me the freedom to choose the subject matter I wanted. And then when I chose it, I was explicitly told you cannot write on that. And I will be like, but the assignment was, I get to choose. This is my choice. And I wrote the papers anyway. I don't care. Because you can't tell the class you have freedom to choose and then tell me, no, you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is, I think, the point that Storm is making is over this idea that teachers don't always, well, in fact, in the British system, you do not get a choice on your curriculum. The government picks, there's a number of curriculum bodies that actually provide the curriculum that schools are going to use. You teach towards the exams, of course, teach towards that curriculum, whichever the curriculum is that is brought into. You as a teacher often inherit the curriculum, so Cambridge, Aqua, or whoever, whichever governing body it is. Those are determined on a national level by government. They're not determined by academics. Academics pick slightly different content than politicians do, and therefore there is a tension, and has always been a tension. I'm a previous high school teacher, secondary school teacher for those in the UK, so I know how that system works, and in most places it's the same thing, and it's an institutional problem in that students are never given the correct information. So now you have a point at which 3,600 employees do not know a dot of colonial history. They have passed through the educational system. Some of these people will hold degrees, and then they will go and they will receive an actual education. They will receive an actual education. And then comes the problem that they don't want to receive it because now it's hurting their feelings. Well, if you had been taught this at 10, maybe your feelings wouldn't be hurt at 40. With all due respect, why are your feelings being hurt? If it was so long ago, and again, the argument works both ways. If slavery was so long ago, why are your feelings hurt by learning about it? So you want me to believe it's so long ago that I can't have feelings about it, but you are relearning the same history as me, and you are allowed your feelings, and we have to bear those feelings out? No, forget that. Forget that mess. That's nonsense. That doesn't even make any sense. It's so illogical that, and I'm going to say it as a generalization, that white people get to have the no, it's too much. Oh my gosh, I feel browbeaten. This isn't education, it's abuse, and blah, 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 blah. When they're simply learning the facts of your own country's history. But you will turn around and tell a person of color, oh, you're being all in your feelings. Stop it. It was a long time ago. Get over yourself. Hold on. If it was so long ago, why can't you learn about it? If it was that long ago, why can you not stand to sit in a room and learn what your monarchy actually did, learn what your governments actually did? Why can't you do that? That to me is an issue.
Yeah, but I agree with that. And in addition to that, I would say that I think another problem that comes out of this is that it is a further example of the lack of integrity exhibited by this government.
Yeah.
You commissioned people to do the work, to do the report. You committed to educating your staff. And when the work comes back that they need to do, you then turn around and say, no, we are not doing this. That demonstrates a lack of integrity. And I believe that lack of integrity, it comes from the top.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I believe we can say that by the dealings of the current prime minister in regards to Partygate as an example, because there are many, it's clear he has no integrity.
Well,
and listen, you don't have to just take my word for this. You can ask the children that he doesn't look after.
Oh. Oh my gosh. Yes, you said it. Yes, you did. Yes, that is what you said. Yes. Okay. Good. Right then. Okay, so we're going to finish on time this evening on that note, unless anyone has any questions. So the main story for today, if you've missed it, is the fact that the government commissioned a report into the Windrush scandal. One of the many. I think there were over 50 recommendations, as I remember it from what we discussed before. One of those recommendations was that the 3,600 staff that worked for the Home Office and the government should be educated on issues of colonialism and how it has impacted the likes of the Windrush generation. The government commissioned the Coventry University. It cost in excess of £600,000, and then began to delete the work because they did not want to engage with the issue and said it was too difficult for the staff. They would feel upset and browbeaten, and they didn't want that feeling to exist. And so therefore they were not going to do that. Our principle and point is that education should liberate one from one's old ways of thinking. And therefore they should have learned about their own history and their own culture. That's my idea anyway. Anything you'd like to add to this?
I'm sure there's plenty I'd like to add, but you want to finish on time today. So I'm just going to say, bun them people there, yeah?
600, I'd have done it for 5,000. Well, they paid a whole academic institution to do this, and people, yeah. I personally really am so desperate, if anyone ever gets hold of this, to see what the original materials is, because I can almost bet it isn't even that bad. Because you're telling me that an institution like Coventry picked up something that would be really anti-racist work? I doubt that very much. Like, I'm sure it was a robust curriculum, but I can't imagine it was even that bad, really. I doubt anyone would have been left.
You know what? When they say it's browbeat, they'd feel browbeaten. It makes me think that it was written by like some organization like the Hebrew Israelites or something like that, or the Nation of Islam. You know, I'm like, no, this is Coventry University here. I think y'all are gonna be okay. You know,
survive. especially considering like if you then look up University of Coventry's history with anti-racism work, you'll find that there are some cases against Coventry. So I'm pretty sure your information would have been okay. I'm pretty sure that you were on safe territory. So I'd love to see it. If anyone ever gets a copy of it, please do send it to me. I'd be so interested to see what was actually a part of that curriculum, because quite frankly, I cannot imagine that you were going to give anything, it's not going to be something we do here on the dark side, and we have done education for institutions.
You know what? I might know a girl that knows a girl that might be able to hook me up with that.
I think somebody needs to send this to me. Let's just ask somebody. Please do. Please do. If anyone can get us the hookup to see it, because I know for a fact it weren't that bad. Like, it just wasn't. I don't even have to see it to know that, but I know it wasn't, because quite frankly, they got Coventry University to do it. You didn't get an anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, Hebrew Israelite, anybody to do it. And in fact, some of our more radical professors refused to participate because they knew what was coming. You're not gonna take the real truth, so we're not going to be bothered to put all this energy in so that you can then delete it afterwards, right?
Dr. Umar.
All right, come on now.
Listen, you probably no. You know what? Listen, Umar is out there. I mean, they probably be safer with Farrakhan writing the curriculum than Umar.
Umar's away with the fairies. We're not doing that. Okay. Well, listen. We enjoyed this evening. We hope that you did too. This has been The Dark Side with TC Storm and myself, Tabitha Purple. We're here to educate, enlighten, show you that there is a dark side, but we also laugh and smile. And I hope this week wasn't too traumatizing for you, Mr. Holder, although I know some of the story, it'd be worth the 600k you lost. Mind your business. Oh dear, it would be.
I will pay to read that curriculum.
Yeah, but he can do okay. He doesn't know anything about outside of the USA. He barely knows about the USA. What you're saying? What you're saying?
Like, yeah.
Please, come on
but
now.
Umar will be making all sorts of stuff up. He'll be like, Umar would have in his curriculum, something like question, help me build a school.
All right, before this descends into any further chaos between you two people, I'm going to call it. It would be entertaining. I am going to say good night, good evening, be blessed, be wise, be educated, be anti-racist. This was The Dark Side with TC Storm and Tabitha Purple. Bye-bye. You gonna say bye? No?
You said it for me.
Bye.